I think that's one of the great things about aging. One of the gifts is that you really come to see, you know what? I have been doing this life thing for a while now. And thank you for your opinion. Thank you for the information. But I think I know how to do this. I'm going to go my own way.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey Posse, I'm your host, Chrissy Benson, broadcasting to you from Music City, Nashville, Tennessee. Just so you know, in the months coming up, we'll be mixing it up a little bit here at the Posse. Since October of 2022, we, really meaning I, have published an episode every single week without exception. Since I do want to bring some other facets to the Vegan Posse, including live streams, workshops, and group calls, it's possible that going forward, we may shift from being completely weekly to releasing episodes a little less often. And on that note, if you value the work that we do here at the Vegan Posse, bringing vegans together to help animals everywhere, please consider supporting us financially through Venmo or PayPal using the links below, or just search for Vegan Posse in either of those apps. That's Vegan Posse with no space in between. Any amount really helps. Feel free to buy me a virtual coffee, chip in for recording expenses or other tech costs, or just express your love in the greenest way possible. Or orange way possible. Feel free to send Bitcoin. And now for this week's episode with the amazing Victoria Moran. This is not Victoria's first time on the podcast. In fact, she was one of the earliest guests on the Vegan Posse. You can read her full bio in the show notes. But if for some reason you're not familiar with Victoria, she's a prolific author of over a dozen books about veganism, self-help, and spirituality. I first met her personally in 2014 when I participated in her Main Street Vegan Academy in New York City. Victoria's new book, Age Like a Yogi, is out, and it's really, really good. One thing about Victoria's books is that even though I feel that at this point I know a good bit about living vegan, I always come away with some really helpful real-world takeaways. So enjoy this conversation with the amazing Victoria Moran. Victoria, welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the
Hey,
ride of your
Chrissy.
life?
Ooh, better get ready.
Yes, yes. Well, I know you're ready. You've written zillions of books. You've done tons of super cool stuff. And you're here today in part to celebrate the release of your latest book, Age Like a Yogi, which I am so close to finishing, as maybe you can tell from where
Aw,
the bookmark is. But yeah, congratulations. I mean, what an accomplishment. How does it feel to have yet another book out in the world?
you know, this one does feel really good because it is my 14th, and I think any writer who is at all able to be a little bit objective knows which of their books are really good, which ones are just fine but not spectacular, and which ones are, oh my gosh, I kind of wish I hadn't written that one. And I have some of all of those. And this one is definitely up there with, oh yeah, this is my best work. And I'm so proud that it's out in the world. And another cool thing, Chrissy, with this one is I got to read for the audiobook. And that was such a thrill. So to just know that I can talk to people as well as talk to them from the page, it's really fun.
That's amazing. No, that's wonderful that you got to read for the audiobook. How did that require some negotiation? Was that something you had your eye on doing?
I really wanted to read this one So I read for the cassette audiobook of a book I wrote way back in 1997 called Shelter for the Spirit, about making your home nurture your soul. And of course, that was out of, I don't know, we don't say out of print, out of tape long ago. And then I wrote a book called Fit from Within, and there was a CD version. And again, disappeared off into new technology. And so I've got two audios, Main Street Vegan and The Love Powered Diet, that other people read. And I'm grateful to have my books in every form possible, but my books are in the first person. And so I just really feel like I want to read them, especially this one, because when I'm writing Age Like a Yogi, it's everything that I have really devoted my life to for probably the past 55 years or so. And it's also a lot of truth coming from where I am now. I'm about to turn 75, and life does look different, over here. And so to be able to just get that across to people in my own words, certainly in any form that the book comes in, but with my own voice, I wanted a lot. So it was in my book proposal that, not like a deal breaker, because I don't have that kind of power in the publishing industry, but a strong request. So the way that worked was the publisher was fine with it. And so they went out to a couple of audiobook companies, and Tantor Audiobooks was on with taking the book. And then I got to audition, which I didn't mind at all because I did theater as a kid, like all that kind of thing. And I got to spend 3 days in this wonderful studio in Midtown Manhattan, the building that has the Capezio store in it. So all, the childhood, gosh, I wish I was a ballerina kind of dreams got all mixed in there. And it was just a glorious 3 days. And I'm just so happy that the book is out there as a paperback and a Kindle and an audio.
That's incredible. What was it like, speaking the words out loud? Because it does come across differently when you say things as opposed to when you see them in writing.
Yeah, well, something people have always said to me as a writer is that I write like I talk. And I think that's good. And so maybe for me, not quite so different because I really do have a conversational writing style. One thing that I was very careful to do, and I'm sure I was not 100% perfect at it, but I worked very, very hard to look up the yogic terms that come from Sanskrit. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. And so I wanted to make sure that I pronounced everything correctly. That was one of the reasons that I wanted to read the book, because I've read other books in this genre as audios or listened to. I don't know if we say read or listen to when it's audio. And and so often the actors, most of whom are fabulous and wonderful, but very often in this particular genre, they haven't looked up the words. And even the common pronunciations that anybody who takes yoga classes would know are often mispronounced on audiobooks. And that's a little bit like chalk on a blackboard. So I wanted to really be careful with that. And, I had a little crib sheet, with some of the words that I don't say very often in Sanskrit. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. And, too, I have it obviously on Audible on my phone. And I always turn to books and recordings and things to lift me up, lift me up, lift me up. I mean, the reason that I got into writing self-help books, I know, is that I needed help. And so to be able to have among the collection myself speaking my own truth, sometimes we need to listen to ourselves. And it's cool that I have this to listen to.
That's really cool. Yeah, to come to see yourself as some sort of authority, not in the sense of, telling people what to do, but just legitimizing yourself in that regard. That makes
And
total sense.
And we're all the ultimate authority on our own lives. And this is one of the things I do try to get across in the book as well. There's certainly information that we can share with one another, but ultimately we're the boss, you know, And I think that's one of the great things about aging. There are certainly limitations and difficulties and other things that make people not want to hurry to get to be elders. And yet, one of the gifts is that you really come to see, you know what? I have been doing this life thing for a while now. And thank you for your opinion. Thank you for the information. But I think I know how to do this. I'm going to go my own way.
Right. It's my life. It's my life. So do you identify as a yogi?
Ah, I identify as a spiritual seeker, and yoga philosophy has been at the core of that for many, many years. So I started out little bitty kid, kind of weird in terms of an interest in cosmic things. So my first, what I would call spiritual experience, was just before my third birthday. I was in my stroller and my nanny took me out at nighttime. And I don't know why she did that. My parents were probably having a fight. I don't know. But we were out. It was dark. We were in Kansas City, Missouri, where you can see the stars. And I'm in the stroller and I'm looking up at the stars and thinking to myself, well, that's home. I'm here now. I'm doing this. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is not home. And I have a feeling that a lot of 2-year-olds are thinking things like that and just maybe don't remember it, but always interested. And this nanny that I talk about, Dee Dee, she was really my first spiritual teacher. She was quite eccentric. And I think that my parents would not have hired her. She was a live-in nanny because they didn't have daycare then, and both my parents worked. And so she had been in Christian Science, she'd studied Rosicrucianism. So she raised me on reincarnation and meditation and the idea that all of the wisdom traditions were really trying to go in the same direction and get people to the same place, just, different varieties and different colors. So I had this wonderful, eclectic spiritual upbringing. And I've never moved much from that. So yoga came into my life at 17, and it really brought everything together because it said a lot of the things that Dee Dee had taught me. And then one of the other cool things about yoga, because it does have a physical aspect for those who want to include that, is that I could be going on about my spiritual life and exploring purpose and why I'm here and bring my body along. And nobody had ever combined those two for me before. And I wasn't really comfortable in the physical world. I was overweight and I was kind of nerdy. And to be able to have this beautiful spiritual path say, come on, we'll take all of you, body, mind, spirit, take what you like and leave the rest. If we say something you don't like, maybe somebody else will say something that resonates better. What's not to love?
Right, right. Well, I can imagine in some ways some people might be reluctant to bring their body along. They might kind of look for the opportunity to separate those two realms and think like, oh, I can just focus on being spiritual and getting enlightened and not have to think about my body.
Yeah, and you can do that too. And that's one of the wonderful things about yoga. There's so many different varieties. There's jnana yoga, which starts with a J, and that is this beautiful, they say it's the shortest but the steepest path to enlightenment. And it's really an appeal to the scientist, the engineer, these very logical people. A lot of people who are more interested in an atheist, humanistic kind of way of looking at life, but there's a little bit of a spiritual calling in there too. They like this jnana kind of path, which is self-inquiry. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Until everything falls away. Well, gosh, I'm not the body because that's going to leave. And I'm not this mind because that comes through this brain, which won't always be here. So I'm not that. I'm not this heritage. I'm not this personality. I'm not these interests because all that stuff is temporary. And so through this deep self-inquiry, they come to enlightenment. And, they're not standing on their heads or doing downward facing dogs. So what I write about mostly in the book is Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, which does include the asanas. That's one of the limbs. but asana is there with meditation, with moral precepts, with personal disciplines, all combined to make a really beautiful life, spiritual and temporal.
Yeah, that all makes total sense. And I think the idea of bringing the mind and body together, of course, makes perfect sense. And it's something that, for instance, the ancient Greeks, they took that as a given. They were all the great teachers and Socrates and all of those people, Pythagoras, they all had very stringent physical requirements that they incorporated into their teachings with their students. And so it wasn't this artificial separation that we see today of mind and body. So it all makes total sense to me, the way you describe it. One thing I'm curious about is, the reincarnation thing. Like when did you start kind of believing in reincarnation? Or
You
is
know,
it something that's always been with you?
it's always been with me. Of course, I did have Dee Dee, my wonderful nanny,
How long was she your
and
nanny, by the way?
she came when I was 6 months old, and then I very imperfectly cared for her when she was in her 80s and post stroke.
Oh,
Uh, so
wow.
when I got married at 27, she moved with us from Kansas City to the suburbs of Chicago. And eventually she did go to a nursing home, which frankly I will always regret. But know, did the best I could at the time, as we always do. So yeah, Dee Dee was just really, really very important influence in my life. But I always knew I was somewhere before this, and I listened in on adult conversations. So I just feel like I got a lot of understanding early about what most people thought about things. And it was very materialistic. It was selfish. There were a lot of prejudices that as a little kid, fresh from, wherever we were before we're here, I was just like, this isn't quite it. And I heard people talk about life after death. I heard that phrase, life after death. And I remember thinking, well, what a ridiculous phrase, because everybody knows there was life before birth. So why wouldn't there be life after death? So, yeah,
So
I've always had that.
interesting.
And
Wow.
again, yoga teaches reincarnation, Buddhism, Jainism, all the Eastern teachings, even the nature religions of old Europe, the Wiccans, hoof and horn, all things die to be reborn, corn and grain, all things die to live again. So there's this idea throughout human history that maybe one and done isn't quite it. And what I used to think about reincarnation was how cool. That means we never really die because we get to come back and do this again. But of course, in yoga, it's the idea of if you really play your cards right, you won't have to come back and do it again. And it's kind of a different way of looking at things. I guess when you're young and all life is out there before you and everything seems possible and you haven't had many stumbling blocks, it's like, oh, well, this is cool. I get to be this person this time and another person another time. And I wonder who I was last time. But it's really not about that. It's about this ongoing growth to know who we really are. And a very cool concept in yoga is that of the Jivan Mukta. And the woman who wrote the foreword for Age Like a Yogi, Sharon Gannon, is the co-founder of Jivamukti Yoga, wonderful yoga system that's very much based on veganism and has a lot of the ahimsa message in there.
Yeah,
But
I've been to her studio in New York
ah,
City. Although I
cool.
don't think I've done yoga there. I've only eaten at the restaurant.
Yeah, it's
Just
not
out of
there
it.
anymore,
Oh,
unfortunately. Yeah, so much has changed in New York City, which is, that's another yogic teaching. Everything changes. When you're at
yeah,
peace with change, you're at peace.
yeah.
Um, but this concept of the Jivan Mukta is being enlightened while you're in your physical body. And it's a very cool concept because we so often think in not just yoga, but all kinds of traditions, that there's some sort of reward afterwards, or once you leave here, you get elevated to some kind of higher state. But this teaching is no, you become enlightened right here, right now, in your physical body, walking around, doing your job, having your family, going out to eat, which is a really interesting notion. And I think that some people have come face to face with these enlightened beings and they know it. And one person that I believe qualifies as this was Krishnamurti. Now, I never met Krishnamurti myself, but I used to work at the Theosophical Society headquarters, and a lot of those people had met him. And they were very clear that in his presence, they were with another order of human like us, but he had fulfilled his full humanness. He knew who he was. And according to yoga, who we are is the divine incarnate, that at our heart center, we are all that is. We're the great beneficence. We're the force from Star Wars. In yoga, they call it Brahman is the great big ultimate force. And then within us, it's Atman, that force kind of individualized. And when we really know that, not just like, yeah, I think that, like I was in this documentary not long ago, and I was working very intensely with a spiritual teacher who kept drumming into me, all you have to know is that you are Brahman, you are Brahman, you are Brahman. And so this interviewer was saying, who are you? And I'm going, I am Brahman. But while I was saying it was like, what an egotistical and kind of ridiculous thing to say, because even though I do believe that is the truth, I don't believe it yet about me. So it was a silly thing to say in that context because I'm not there yet. But I believe that I will be, and I believe that we all will be. And yoga teaches that that's the fact.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, how do you feel like your progress has been toward that over the course of your lifetime?
Well, somebody asked Edgar Casey how you answer that question, and he said, ask your family, because the people around us can tell. You know, it's one thing to know a lot and be able to quote a lot of stuff, and it's another thing to be able to show up for life in a valiant and selfless way. And that can be really difficult. So for
It
myself,
can, really?
I I know that every day of my life I have done the best that I could do on that day. And I know that I fall short every single day. And so I think that these shortcomings that we have in the 12 steps, they call them defects of character, that's like our lessons in the school of life. The things that come easy, well, good. Maybe we learned those lessons at some earlier point. And the things that are tough, they're just going to be tough until we overcome them. And I still have plenty to overcome.
Right, right. Well, don't we all? And this may be outside your wheelhouse or your frame of reference, but I'm curious if you have any particular views on how psychological conditions like depression, anxiety, the things that a lot of people struggle with, how do they factor into this way of viewing life?
That is a really interesting question, and you are absolutely right that it is out of my wheelhouse. But I do know that there is a new book coming by Dr. David Frawley, who is a yogi and an Ayurvedic physician, medical doctor, but practices Ayurveda, that is about Ayurveda and psychology, about this wonderful sister science of yoga and how it applies to our psychological health. So I would assume, and I am just conjecturing here, that there's some sort of karmic pattern. I believe that there's a reason for everything, even when we don't understand it. And that's another thing that reincarnation is pretty good about, because when something is inexplicable, that can sometimes explain it. And I also know, and this is actually documented, and I talk about this in Age Like a Yogi, that for many, many deeply embedded psychological conditions, some of these yoga practices can be so therapeutic. So, asana practice, pranayama, which is breathing, meditation, and obviously, if somebody is in deep depression, you don't want to do any of these things without consulting with your psychologist, psychiatrist, because it is possible that if someone is truly depressed and they sit quietly and go within, it's going to take them further down that rabbit hole. But the overwhelming majority of the scientific studies show all sorts of remarkable healing, depression, anxiety, and then even getting into things like dementia, Alzheimer's, and keeping the shrinkage of the brain that happens in older age from happening so rapidly. So it's a very, very powerful system. You just need to take care of yourself on every level.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. I guess where I'm wondering is, what depression is in this framework. Like, is depression, I mean, I think in general it's lack of self-integration, something is there's a mismatch somewhere, we're not accepting ourselves, or we're viewing ourselves in a certain way that may be just really causing us pain. So I'm just wondering how it would be framed in this world, in this realm. But that's just kind of an esoteric question. For instance, in evolutionary psychology, they view depression and anxiety as signals. Depression is generally speaking, your life isn't going as you had thought it should. You're getting signals that you're not quite as good as you thought, or as talented as you had hoped, or as charming and charismatic as maybe you were. And you're getting signals from the world that indicate that, oh, I had thought that I would achieve certain things in life, and it doesn't seem to be going that way. And so this recalibration process of, oh, I really, you know, I had a higher estimation of myself, and life is giving me a different sort of set of feedback, which is kind of a depressing way to look at depression. But I mean, I don't think it's entirely without validity, but anxiety in that realm is, well, the sense that, okay, if things line up, if the stars align and things just operate seamlessly, then I think I'll be able to pull this off. But there's like a lot that could go wrong. And so that's where anxiety comes, is like,
Mm.
oh, like I could do it if everything goes, 100%, but there's a good chance that I won't. Whereas the feeling of excitement and enthusiasm tends to happen when we think that the odds are in our favor. Like, oh, I think the chances are pretty good I'm going to be able to pull this off, and it's going to be amazing when I do. And what will that feel like? So yeah, just all different ways of experiencing reality, I guess. And we
Mm.
give them names and we give them psychological labels, but it's just interesting to me, because I operate to some extent in those different realms. I'm in
Yes.
school for clinical mental health counseling, and I'm a longtime practitioner of meditation, and have done yoga, not to the extent that you have. So yeah, for me, I just find it interesting to consider all the connections and crossovers.
Well, I think that some of the things that we get in the yogic teachings, the idea that life is a school. And so whenever we have these things to go through, whether it's emotional, physical losses, things that happen to us in life, that it's like signing up for calculus when we could have just taken, art history. And I also think that there's this idea of karma, the idea that we know coming here in this teaching, at least, that there will be certain challenges that we're going to grow through. And I find that that helps me some. I'm going through a very, very difficult period now, and it's actually been going on for several years. My husband has had a series of health crises and a lot of disability at this point. I never, ever thought I would be a caregiver. It's sort of like, okay, God, I'll do a lot of stuff, but you're not going to give me that one, right? Well, here we are. And I have not dealt with it to the degree of poise and equanimity and acceptance and all that good stuff that I would have hoped. So it's telling me, well, this is not one of those easy classes. This really is calculus. And yet that's what the soul grows on and through. And I also understand that depression and anxiety are disease conditions and they need treatment, and people who have them need a great deal of compassion. So it's not to say, oh, well, this is your lesson, just go learn it, because it's not simple at all. And the first moral precept of yoga is ahimsa, which is compassion, and that's compassion to ourselves and compassion to others. So I think when we're dealing with something like this, or someone we care about is dealing with something like this, our job is to shore the person up, even if it's ourself, and to get what we need. Because even though life is going to have some difficulties, it's it's normal and natural and right that we try to improve them and get through them.
Right. Yeah. And I know you've definitely had your hands full with a lot of life challenges these past few years. And I think that's a great perspective just in terms of viewing everything through this lens of learning. I'm thinking of the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, which I don't know if you've read that one, but it's all about having a growth mindset as opposed to having a fixed mindset. And basically the distinction is a fixed mindset. You think you've got a certain limited amount of potential or talent or intelligence or ability. And the growth mindset is that you believe, and this is documented by lots of research, that you can get better at anything. And, no matter what it is, like how good you'll be able to get, that's an open-ended question. And yes, different people will, get better at different things, but anyone can get better at anything. And that the real key to just living a happy and enriching life is to fall in love with that learning process, rather
What
than,
a beautiful attitude.
yeah, well, it was this book was recommended to me by a business coach I was working with at the time. It was painfully on point. I didn't realize it was a personalized recommendation. I thought she gave it to all her clients to read, but she recommended it specifically to me because, well, coincidentally, a lot of people who are praised early on for being smart or just having certain abilities, that even though it's usually done with you know good intent, but it can have the effect of entrenching in kids this fixed mindset, this attachment to results and status. Because if we get attached to this concept of being smart, then we're afraid to take a calculus class because what if it's hard? What if we don't do as well? What if we don't get the A? Or what if it's hard to get the A? Then does that mean we're not really smart? Like we're just a faker? So it's interesting that there's a lot of parenting advice in that book in terms of the sorts of praise and validation that we give kids. And so, yeah, I unfortunately I recognize that in many ways I had fallen prone to this fixed mindset, and that the whole to flip that way of looking at things, like you said, it's about learning, it's about growth, and we're going to be forced to grow and learn. But if we can actually come to enjoy it as well, then that's where we have a chance at a happy, enjoyable life. Easier said than done sometimes. But I'm interested, based on one of the chapters in your book, just like how helpful do you think it is to talk about our challenges and talk about our difficulties with other people? And how much of that talking and, conversation should we be doing?
Well, I do a lot of it, and in my life, I've done a lot of it. Part of that is because I'm very verbal. Part of it is I have a 12-step background, so talking about things has been inculcated in me since my 20s. But I'm beginning now to think that I would like to talk a little less because you can talk about things to the degree that you need to. So if you have a therapist, you have a best friend, you have your own true love, and you can share these things, that's really good. But then I think what happens, and I've certainly been guilty of this, is, the rehash, the rehash, the rehash, the story, the story, the story. And what yoga tells me is that this reality is at best temporary. In yoga, they say Maya, illusion. And this, I am not this body. This body has been given to me, and I need to take really good care of it and be grateful for it and all that. But this body goes through life experiences for a purpose. And the idea that because something bad happened to me, I need to just tell people and tell people and tell people doesn't seem to change anything. It just gets me really good at telling the story.
Mm.
So, my understanding from the yogic perspective is, of course, take care of your psychological health, tell your friend, tell your sponsor, tell whoever it is that needs to hear it. But then just be willing to let that be, because any experience that's already happened is in the past. So, yes, it happened, and yes, it can have effects going forward, but the experience itself is poof, it's in its present happening time that's gone. And it's easier. I'm beginning to see now through yoga and simply through life that moving through is is more efficient than doing too much looking back.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I'm starting to feel that way too, that, all this reflection and rehashing with people. Yeah, how much is it holding us back from, just engaging in the present moment and just moving on? And also, I think identifying with suffering. Like I really would like to learn to connect with people through joy and happiness and activity rather than just over sharing, this connection we have because I shared something deeply painful with somebody.
Right. I mean, and I think there's room for the full spectrum of human experience. And it's not like, oh my gosh, I told somebody my problems 3 times yesterday. What's wrong with me? Not a thing. Not a thing. We are all right on time and doing fine. But something that came to me actually, I think just this morning after meditation was the idea that we can build our lives from the pieces that it contains at this moment. And a lot of the angst that I have been suffering lately, and I don't talk about all of this in the book simply because the book was done a year before it came out. So some of that was came after. And yet, what I have in my life today is what I have in my life today. I am the age that I am, and my husband has the negative and positive aspects of what's going on with him. And and we have a dog that we absolutely love. And we have a rescue pigeon who is really cool and really interesting to know. And beyond our immediate home environment, we have children. And William tragically lost one son, rest his soul, but he has two others, and I have my daughter, and none of them are local. And there's this sadness of, oh my gosh, I wish they were all here, like the Norman Rockwell kind of paintings, nobody goes anywhere, everybody's right there. And yet, the fact is, they exist in the world, they love us, we love them. They're having these wonderful lives. And there are certain things that we can all kind of add up. I think this is why gratitude lists have been so popular in that world of kind of self-development for so long, because it shows us what we have to work with, what we have to build with. And it's sort of like, okay, so one of the things I don't have to build with right now is that I am 18 years old and trained as a gymnast. Nope, don't have that one. But I've got all these other ones. And so rather than focusing on, the ship that sailed, let's focus on the ship that we've got and see if we can turn it into the Queen Mary.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I've been having a similar realization lately. Like I can tend to get disheartened when I feel like I'm stuck in certain areas and certain things just are never going to change. I know it's been this way for so long and it's just going to be this way forever. Well, it finally occurred to me, well, number one, often, of course, that's inaccurate or there's no way of, gauging the accuracy of that prediction. But even if that assumption is completely true and valid that this particular thing that I'm frustrated about is never going to change, well, all the more reason to learn to enjoy what there is to enjoy and appreciate what there is to appreciate. And like you said, work with the pieces that are here right now that may be all the pieces I'll ever have. So let's,
Well,
yeah.
and we see this so often in people who have issues with infertility and they want to have children. And very often that doesn't happen and doesn't happen. And then they adopt. And then they're pregnant, sometimes even before the adopted baby shows up.
Yeah.
And this has happened so many times. This is so documented. I know a family that adopted, I think it was four children from somewhere in Central America, and they were just getting going and everything was right. And this is our life. And then the wife comes out pregnant without any kind of intervention. And there's something I think in life, and I think we can learn from that example. And oh, another one is the true love deal of when it's like, I got to find my partner, I've got to find my mate. Ugh. Never happens, never happens, never happens. And then somebody is just like, okay, forget it. I'm going to buy a house. That's a big one. You buy a house and then the person shows up, or have a baby on your own and then the person shows up. It's just like when we let go of that tremendous need, it kind of gives the universe room to work.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've certainly seen that happen. I think the tricky part about that whole equation, of course, is that when we let go, we have to really let go. We can't let go thinking that, oh, I'm letting go because when I do, then I'll get what I want.
Yeah, no, that's not letting go.
Yeah, yeah, it's not letting go. Well, I love your book. I mean, I've read a lot of your books. I can't say all of them because you've written so many, and I so admire just your I don't know if what's the noun for prolific?
I'm not
Is
sure.
there
It
one?
should be prolificness. That just sounds
Prolificness,
funny.
prolificity,
Yeah.
prolificity. But I really just admire and aspire to be a prolific author as well. And since I've read your books, I'm always amazed at how you find just a different take on things. You find new things to say, and it's really helpful. And I really enjoy too just how kind of short and just delightful the chapters were in this book because they're not long chapters. You can they're just kind of like this really nice size of just a few pages. Like, was that something that you had planned or did it just work out that way?
Most of my books have been like that. I've discovered early on that even before we were spending so much of our time in online, and that people's attention spans are not very long. And that's not a criticism because we're really busy. And so to just fit an idea into the attention span that is available to people has seemed to work well for me in my books for a very long time. I guess my first short chapter book was Creating a Charmed Life, which came out in 1999. And that was a little square book, 75 chapters. It's my bestseller to date. And yeah, so I've done mostly little short chapter books, and they seem to speak to people.
Yeah, I can see why, for sure. Also, in this book, you certainly make many references to veganism and talk about it, a fair amount, but it's not the focus of the book. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how much of a vegan message readers have been taking away from the book? And part of the reason I ask, I'll preface that question or ask after the fact, just in my novel Marrying Myself, which has a vegan protagonist, and veganism is not the focus of the plot, but it plays an integral part. It's funny to me because I learned that there were a good number of readers who noted the vegan part, but a lot who it just went completely over their heads. So yeah, so with Age Like a Yogi, how much vegan are people taking away?
Yeah, well, the book is very new, so I'm not sure yet, but it was very much a part of why I wrote the book. So, on the one hand, I wanted to write Age Like a Yogi because aging is a thing. I mean, it is a thing. And so to be able to add something to that to help people was important. Also, even though I've been in yoga, gosh, longer than I've even been vegetarian, because it was yoga that got me to take the
Mm,
plunge to vegetarian, and vegan came later. And I've mentioned yoga probably in every book I've ever written. I used to be a contributing editor for Yoga Journal magazine. I mean, it's been an integral part of my life, but I'd never written a book about yoga. So that was important to me.
mm.
But the third reason that I wrote the book, I kind of call it my skinny bitch book. Anybody who read that 2005 book, you look at a title like that, you look at the cover they put on it, and this was for women who wanted to lose weight. But once you get into that book, it's a vegan manifesto. And mine isn't quite a vegan manifesto, but the veganism is through the book because I just want it to be seen that vegan is normal. And not everybody will make that choice, but it's still normal. Like I'm going to be going soon to a lovely yoga retreat center to do a retreat about Age Like a Yogi. And they used to be all vegetarian, and now they're not. They made the determination, I guess, to attract more people that they needed to have animal products. And so they have two lines. And the line with meat says regular, and the other one says vegetarian. And I just think it would be such a great boon moving ahead for society if the line that was vegetarian said regular and the other one said omnivore or something, kind of like at the coffee places where people say regular milk. I just want to say it's not regular, say cow's milk. I'm not saying, don't serve it. Of course, I would rather they didn't serve it, but let's just say what something is. So in Age Like a Yogi, I share that I'm vegan. I share that even though there's a lot in this book in terms of the physical health aspects about Ayurveda, which I love to pieces. I find it just such a wonderful way to customize self-care to really truly take care of the person that each of us is. But Ayurveda likes ghee, which is clarified butter. Well, I like Ayurveda and I don't use ghee. And so the idea that, you don't have to buy a system hook, line, and sinker. You can take what's good or what you perceive to be good and leave what you don't want to be dealing with. But I do get in some detail in the chapter about ahimsa, in a chapter about yoga's vegetarian history, which it absolutely has, the vegan message.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of veganism and vegetarianism being normal, they definitely were normal in the yoga world. So yeah, I think that's a very valid point about the two lines. And in terms of your love for Ayurveda, to me that would be so frustrating to just have such a deep appreciation and admiration for, this view, this spiritual approach, and to have it just revere dairy and ghee. Like, does that just bother the heck out of you?
Well, it's cultural. And I think that when we're trying to be vegan in a non-vegan world, that's really what we're bumping up against the most. So in traditional yoga in India, yes, the dairy is there, and we know that there's a butter company in India that uses a little Krishna because Krishna was supposedly raised by milkmaids and he really liked butter. Well, I don't deny that that may be historical fact, but that doesn't mean that if he were alive today, he would want to advertise butter. Just like people talk about Jesus and fish. I mean, we don't really know what these people ate that lived thousands of years ago. But I just believe that if they were who they said they were, if they were here now, they would be vegan. And so I have to live up to the best that I know now. And for me, that's vegan. So ahimsa does come from this Eastern tradition. Um, in the ancient days, there was animal sacrifice going on in the Vedic world, just like there was in Judea at the times of the Bible. And yet people evolved out of that. Although I've heard, I know in the movie Christspiracy, it's coming back and this is terrible. But generally speaking, animal sacrifice is not part of the vast majority of religious and spiritual traditions that people follow these days. So for me, I appreciate the vegetarian message within yoga, and it was really vegetarian. I'm no fish, no eggs. So it was just the dairy. And what's happened now, unfortunately, in the West, as yoga has become such a big thing, certainly asana practice, the physical part of yoga, we have so many teachers from the US, from other Western countries, who have thrown out the vegetarian thing, not just haven't embraced veganism, but just we don't have to do that anymore. I was at a yoga center, I don't know, 10 years ago, and sometimes, when your ego gets in, you always get a little bit of that's not good. So there's a book there, an anthology by a former editor of Yoga Journal. And I happened to have an essay in that book. It was about going vegan for yogis. And so my ego said to this yoga teacher who was standing next to me, "Oh, that book, my essay on veganism is in that." And instead of her saying, "Oh, wow, how cool is that?" she said, "Isn't it great that now that there's humane farming, we don't have to be vegetarian anymore?" And I was literally speechless because you never had to be vegetarian. It was just the teaching. I think of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society, and somebody said to her, "What's wrong with eating meat?" And I guess she was quite the contrarian, and she said, "Well, there's nothing wrong with it unless you want to stop your spiritual growth." And so the idea that someone imbued in yoga who supposedly has an understanding of ahimsa just wanting to throw out that beautiful teaching when what we are given is here's this beautiful ancient teaching and it's vegetarian and it includes dairy. But here we are now, 21st century, where in the yogic traditions, it's funny that when they talked about the foods that people should eat for spiritual growth, to be able to meditate for long periods, it was fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And then they added milk from healthy cows. So I don't think there's a whole lot of healthy cows out there. And there's certainly not karma-free milk. I don't know that there wasn't a way to have a perfectly beautiful symbiotic relationship with the family cow and share the milk with this cow's offsprings and care for the offspring 4,000 years ago. Because I wasn't around 4,000 years ago. Well, maybe I was with the reincarnation thing.
Right, right, right.
But now we've just outgrown it. No, it's like so many other things. There were things that people thought were right and normal, even as long as I've been alive. And now we look back. I mean, the kinds of jokes that I heard on television as a kid, they would be horrifying today. And so we evolve, and hopefully that vegan yogis and vegan people and other spiritual kinds of traditions can lift those traditions up, or in the case of yoga, bring it back to its own ideal of ahimsa.
Yes, that makes sense to me. All right. Well, I've got just a couple more questions for you. You have such a rich and full range of experience that it's just so tempting to talk to you about so many topics as I've taken the opportunity to do. But I wanted to ask on a more personal level. You mentioned in the book that you experienced some negative effects after taking the COVID-19 shot. How are you doing now? And are you feeling better?
Well, I'm completely over the actual pathology that came shortly thereafter. What happened first? Well, what happened actually first was I'm not a big drug person in any way. I don't seem to do well with drugs, with Western medical procedures, just in general. I mean, I know it needs to be there and it's important, and I'm grateful that it's there. And yet, for me, I prefer to use it as little as possible because we're just, I don't know, not compatible. So I wasn't going to jump right in and take the vaccine as soon as it was available. But a lovely friend, again, got to me through my ego. This is so interesting. We've got to so watch that ego. And they were trying to help older people when only older people could get the shots, find ways to get them, find places to get them, get in, the line and all that. And I said, yeah, I think I want to wait maybe till summer and just kind of see what comes out in the literature and make sure this thing is okay. And they said, you have to do this because you are a treasure. And ego, boom, I'm a treasure. I'm going to do this. Completely silly, but that's what I did. So I had the first shot, and within 24 hours, I had cystic acne. Now, interestingly enough, I had just turned 70. So people have a lot of things to think about when they're 70. Generally, acne is not going to be one of them. And it was bad. It was bad enough that I had to go to a dermatologist and get cortisone shots in my face. So 2 weeks later, time for the second shot. And the acne was starting to clear up. And I went to the clinic and said to the nurse or whoever she was, I don't know. I don't know if I should get the second one because I broke out in this horrible acne. And she just, it just kind of, she's just like,
Brushed it off. Yeah.
And so I got the second one. I went home. I slept for 14 hours and I was never fully awake after that. So I would just fall asleep, I would fall asleep. At that time, my Main Street Vegan podcast was also a radio show at 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoons. So I had an alarm set 2:45 every Wednesday because I didn't know if I'd be asleep. I was
Wow.
getting my Raja Yoga teacher certification in a Zoom course at that time. And one of the rules was you have to show your face. And I just contacted them and said, I need to be let out of that rule because I have to lie down and maybe I'll fall asleep and then I'll listen to the recordings, but I can't help it. So I was calling it narcolepsy and I didn't know where to go for help. So I knew that there was an Ayurvedic doctor. He's also a Western internist, but he only practices Ayurveda, Dr. Scott Gerson. He practices now in Dunedin, Florida. And I contacted him and he said, well, it's not narcolepsy, it's chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is being reported in some of the journals from Europe, but they're not reporting it over here. It's not common, but it's definitely happening. And all I can tell you is to do panchakarma, which is when Ayurveda pulls out all the stops and you spend 5 to 10 or even longer days in a cleansing, but very different cleansing than we think of in the West treatment program. And to do that, I needed to go to Florida. And I thought, how am I going to get to Florida? I can't get to the mailbox. But
Hmm.
he put me on an Ayurvedic kind of pre-panchakarma program. And by doing that, couple of weeks, I got some energy back. And so I was able to get to the airport, and I was not about to rent a car, but I got an Uber and got to where he was. And I did get over that. And I'm so grateful. So my energy is back. I no longer have chronic fatigue syndrome, but I saw what that vaccine did to my body, and those spike proteins are still in me. So I do want to do the spike protein detox with the nattokinase and bromelain and curcumin. I haven't done it yet because I'm doing some other herbal things for some other situations, but that's definitely on my list. And does that make me anti-vax? Does it mean I don't think anybody should be vaccinated for anything? No. I mean, I know that we don't have smallpox and we've pretty much eradicated polio. And I do believe that those vaccines are part of the reason why that's the case. However, the number and the I mean, it's overwhelming to me. I think about the vaccines that I had as a child, and my dad was a doctor. And I think, well, I had smallpox because that was required when I was a little bitty tiny kid. I think it was eradicated by the time I was 2 or 3, and then it was no longer required. And I did get the polio shots because I was alive for the polio epidemic of the 1950s. But I don't think I had any other vaccinations. And when I was a kid, you were supposed to get, quote, childhood diseases. And I wasn't getting them. And it was almost like kind of a little weirdness. Like when I finally got the measles at 13, I remember my dad just bursting into this beautiful smile of my kid who is weird and believes in reincarnation is finally doing something normal. And I understand that measles is a more potent disease now than it was then, but still the number of vaccinations that kids are getting, I find it really troubling. It's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is I want everybody to be vegan. But there's a little bit of that going on there as well, because those early vegans back in the 1940s in England financed and supported the Nature Cure College and the Nature Cure Clinic because they wanted to be able to take care of their health without resorting to allopathic medicine, which always has in its history animal experimentation. There's a lot of slaughterhouse byproducts in some of the drugs. And so self-preservation is a thing. We have to do what we have to do. We have to use our good sense to take care of ourselves and our children as we see fit. And that's why I think health freedom is an important thing, because I think we do have that right, or we should have that right. But yeah, that was my COVID-19 vaccine experience. I got no boosters. I will get no boosters. And, if that makes me a radical, I guess I'm a radical.
There you go. Wow. Well, I'm glad you're doing better. You look amazing. You definitely
Thank
have
you.
that spark, that energy, just that inner light that you've written about and that you demonstrate. So I'm glad for you that you emerged victorious from that ordeal. Um, yeah, yeah. Well, I'd say we've covered a lot of territory in this conversation. So thank you for being willing to go there wherever it went. I really appreciate that about you and just your presence in my life, especially my vegan life. You know, you've been a key player from pretty much day one when I took your Main Street Vegan Academy course in person there in New York
Yay.
City. Yeah.
And I do want to do a shout out for Main Street Vegan Academy. It's on Zoom, but it is live and it is interactive. and you talk with the instructors and you get to know me and you get this wonderful support network of all of the other graduates. So if you are interested in taking your vegan outreach to the next level, do check out mainstreetvegan.com. We'll be having cohort number 37 this fall. And people tell me when it's over, next to having my children, this is the best thing I've ever done. And why don't you charge more? Well, maybe someday I will. So come now while it's still while it's still inexpensive. And it is. It's quite wondrous. So do take a look.
Agreed. Yes, I definitely endorse all those sentiments. Yeah, it was a truly special experience and changed my life for sure.
Oh,
So,
bless you, Chrissy. Well, it's such a wonderful just gift to me to get to know you and so many of my graduates. I've got about 700 now, so obviously I'm not
amazing.
close with everybody, but I am so interested in everybody and what they're all doing. And they're doing so many amazing things. Some have started businesses, some are working for plant-based companies or animal rights organizations. People are writing books, as you have, podcasting and just doing incredible things and getting the message out there because it's a hard sell. It's especially a hard sell now. There is a pushback on veganism that we weren't seeing back in 2019, year of the vegan, you know. And it's an interesting thing that people with whom I agree about certain things are just adamantly pushing this meat and dairy agenda that breaks my heart
Yeah.
because for me, and as the yoga teaching goes, ahimsa is the highest teaching, that kindness, that compassion, that preservation of life. There's just nothing more spiritual or more practical than that. So
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
kudos to the vegan posse.
Yeah. Kudos to the posse. And yeah, it is. I share your angst and I share that frustration, of course, because to me it seems so obvious, in terms of ahimsa, veganism is such low-hanging fruit, eating vegan. It's so doable, so helpful, so powerful, and so beneficial, even from a selfish perspective. And yet, like you said, it's a hard sell. But
Can I ask
hey,
you a question, Chrissy? Do we have another
sure,
minute?
sure, yeah.
So, on that, I've thought about this so much since every time I open Instagram, it's raw milk and beef tallow and all these things that I find horrifying. Sometimes I almost wish that being vegan were not health promoting, that I could answer those people and say, well, you're right. I know I've got to work really hard to be a vegan and not get sick, but I'm willing to do it because it's the right thing to do. And then they might not agree with me, but they would have to just honor what I'd said. But when we come back with, well, look at this study and this study and this study and this study, and look how it reverses heart disease, which we used to believe wasn't even possible. And then the arguments are there. So, what do you do with all that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think it's true because sometimes we're so eager to convey the message in language and from a perspective that people will relate to that we end up muddying that message, because the message is ahimsa and do unto others, the golden rule. But then when we start pulling in this additional information about the benefits to health and environmental benefits, and then that becomes a data point that can be, refuted, not convincingly, but it becomes a data point to be argued. And yeah. I don't know. I don't have I don't have an answer, but I think yeah, it really is interesting. Just, I mean, for me, it was a pretty profound, and I hesitate to use this term because I'm I'm a Buddhist minded heathen, but it was a spiritual experience when I went vegan for the animals because I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to participate in this sociopathic so called food system. So that's why I went vegan. But then I'd also had what I considered a parallel interest in health and nutrition, which I considered completely separate from from making the vegan leap. And to come to find that, oh, those two completely intersected and overlapped. And not only that, being vegan was the best thing I could do for the planet and the environment and for starving children in Africa who didn't have, get food. When I discovered that, oh, no matter what angle you approach it from, veganism is the way. This is the way. And to me, it really demonstrated love as a principle of physics. And in hindsight, it seems obvious. Like, how could the products of violence and torture and suffering, ever conceivably, be beneficial to my human health? It didn't make any sense. So when I kind of had that awakening and just realized, oh, this is more than just a personal choice and more than even just the animals, even though the animals that is the key, the integral piece. That's what veganism is. Without the animal rights welfare component, it wouldn't be called veganism. But yeah, then it just makes the stakes so much higher too, because when people push back on the message, they're pushing back on that whole insight I think that we vegans have, and they're pushing back on love. They're saying no, just not that important. Yeah. Well, topic for another conversation.
And I'm
Yes.
sure we'll have one.
So Victoria, any closing thoughts before we wrap up, or just final messages you'd like to convey about veganism or life in general?
Well, thanks for being part of the Vegan Posse, especially now when we're not necessarily the cool kids on the block that we were a few years ago, but that's okay because whenever you can look a cow or a pig or a chicken in the eye and be able to say, it feels good to know that I'm not harming you and your relatives, that just means the world. And I think it's also very yogic. It's certainly ahimsa in expression. So thank you, Chrissy, and everybody listening. Sometimes, Chrissy, I wish we could all get together in a giant stadium and have
Yes.
a big old vegan, what we used to call in the 60s, love-in.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be
Yeah.
fun?
Let's do it. Let's do it. Yeah. All right. Well, we close every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all the suffering animals, human and non-human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So, Victoria, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.